Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to my virtual talk today. My name is Rebecca Ingram, and I will be talking about my research which took place in West Hawaiʻi, looking closely at how we can enhance monitoring of cultural ecosystem services through place-based indicators. I'd like to begin by defining the term cultural ecosystem services because I'll be using this term a lot throughout my presentation. Generally, these are non-material services, benefits, or values that exist because of the environment. Cultural services are something that we experience or value and are not always associated with a tangible object or outcome. They are important because they contribute directly and indirectly to human well-being, and they also can be difficult to count or measure, especially in comparison to another type of ecosystem service, such as fish abundance. Consequently, cultural services are frequently left out of management, which is an issue because they are so critical to human well-being. The figure at the bottom of this slide shows just a few examples of cultural ecosystem services, such as heritage and spirituality, but this is certainly not an exhaustive list. And additionally, because I was focused on the marine and coastal environment in my research, many of my examples and results are going to relate to the ocean. So I mentioned that cultural ecosystem services are frequently left out of resource management, and I want to explain what that looks like in more detail. Typically in things like ecosystem assessments or evaluations, managers use indicators to understand what is happening in the environment. In this figure, there are examples of material things above the water that are usually measured by conventional indicators. For example, ecological data such as the number of fish, and sometimes social experiences are also included, such as recreation or fishing effort. Some cultural ecosystem services are covered within these conventional indicators. For instance, recreation is usually defined as a cultural ecosystem service, but a lot is still missing. If we go under the water in this figure, we see what tends to be left out of indicator suites. These are things that are often non-material, perhaps invisible, and difficult to count. They include emotions, values, and beliefs that exist because of the ocean and coastal regions. These things tend to remain under the surface, are not included in management, and overall are left to be a bit ambiguous. So this poses a question. By measuring the things that we can count, such as fish abundance and population data, are we measuring the things that count to people, things that really matter to people, such as heritage, spirituality, and identity? Without knowing more about what we are not counting, like these cultural ecosystem services, we can't know how much of an impact that absence has in our community. To address this gap, we conducted unstructured interviews that focused on the cultural ecosystem services in West Hawaiʻi specifically and the ways that people rely on and care for them. We also wanted to examine the relationship between cultural services and human well-being, so that was built into the interview guide as well. And ultimately, the goal was that interviews could help identify indicators that would balance out the conventional indicator suites that currently exist. In other words, we didn't want to assume that just because we're monitoring and caring for the ecological aspects of the environment, that the cultural aspects would automatically be taken care of as well. Here we can look at the interview demographics. I conducted 24 interviews with 31 people, so that was a mixture of group and one-on-one interviews. Interviewee ages ranged from 25 to 86, and interviews themselves lasted from 45 minutes to 2.5 hours. The interviewees were all West Hawaiʻi community members. Everyone was active in coastal or ocean conservation in some way, and many were involved in formal resource management, either through a volunteer or paid position. And just as a reminder, these interviews were centered on understanding cultural ecosystem services. So the questions all related back to that in some way, trying to understand how people relied on, interacted with, and valued those cultural services. There were many results of this research process, but today I'm going to narrow it down and just give you 3 key take-home results. Number 1, this research helped to enhance our understanding of monitoring cultural ecosystem services by including not only the ecological data, but also identifying meanings and experiences. The second result that I want to share is how cultural services are vitally connected to one another, or as other studies have phrased it, they are bundled together. And lastly, I will share how the first two results fed into identifying place-based indicators that focus on cultural rather than just ecological elements of the environment. I'll begin by explaining how the interview process and results helped build an understanding of how to improve monitoring and measuring of cultural ecosystem services and their associated benefits and values. In this figure here, we see a blue box outlined in white, which is representing everything that goes into monitoring. Currently, in monitoring of any ecosystem service, we largely have to rely on the ecosystem data or the ecosystem component because that's what we have data for. This research helped to understand what else is missing from this box and from this equation, and that was based on how interviewees shared their stories during interviews. They did not just talk about the ecosystem or one single species, for example, when they were discussing how the environment contributes to their lives, but rather they spoke of their experiences, values, beliefs, and connections to the environment in a complex and integrated manner. This led us to add two other pieces of the equation into our monitoring box here. The first is meanings, which include things like values, beliefs, and perspectives, which are going to create and shape our experiences, the second item here. Experiences can also be thought of as an access point or a conduit that exists between a person and the environment. Sometimes that's something like an activity, sometimes it's something like a connection, just between you and a place or you and an experience itself. From here, our research looked to create indicators that would help balance out this equation, which meant focusing on indicators for meanings and experiences specifically. The second result that I'll share was also important in shaping how we identified indicators. During interviews, people talked about cultural ecosystem services in a manner that did not tease them apart from one another or from other concepts that are related to human well-being. This is something that other similar studies have also seen. So here are two quotes on the slide that represent this bundling concept. In both quotes, the interviewees are explaining what activities they do in the ocean, but they also go on to talk about what those activities mean to them. It's more than just recreation, it's positive emotions, heritage, identity, and even more. So this graph is displaying the number of times that a particular cultural service was mentioned at the same time as another cultural service, or at the same time as another topic that's related to human well-being, such as mental health. So sense of place, for example, is the number one cultural service on this graph. So it was bundled together very frequently, 67 times to be exact, with another service or human well-being topic. This is a really important result. People did not tease apart services from one another or from human well-being in general. They bundled things together in their discussions, in their examples, and in their stories. So when we're thinking about creating indicators to better understand cultural ecosystem services, knowing that this bundling exists is crucial. It suggests that monitoring one cultural service at a time would be difficult or impossible because that's not how people experience them, so that wouldn't reflect accurately. Ultimately, knowing this impacts what we are trying to measure or monitor. So by using the understanding of the first two results, we identified about 100 indicators that would be relevant to West Hawaiʻi. These indicators came from both related similar research or were created directly from the interview analysis process. The final list of indicators includes both objective and subjective indicators, indicators that are measuring cultural ecosystem services directly as well as indirectly via a proxy. Some indicators have existing supporting data, but many do not. And importantly, these indicators highlight and measure all areas of the equation that I spoke of earlier between meanings, experiences, and the ecosystem, but especially those meanings and experiences. So I'm going to show you guys just a few examples of the indicators that were identified. Of course, I can't show you all 100 of them, but in this table, I'll show you 3 potential indicators, the cultural ecosystem services that are represented by that indicator, and the quote that supports the relationship between those. The 3 indicators shown here are eating locally caught or grown food, the use of traditional place names, and an opportunity for viewing the underwater ocean environment. Each indicator is representing more than one cultural ecosystem service, which represents that bundling of services. And the quotes here are supporting the connection between the indicator and each service. We don't have time to go into each quote right now, but I'll just take this opportunity to remind everyone that these presentations are available online, so if you'd like, you can come back to them and read each one. And also, while each indicator is relevant to West Hawaiʻi as a whole, according to interviews, each specific community within West Hawaiʻi can and should identify the specific indicators that meet their own needs and goals. In conclusion, the results of this research increased our understanding of how to best monitor and understand the bundling of cultural ecosystem services and use these understandings to create and identify place-based indicators. From here, we can integrate these results with community goals and needs. We also need to increase our primary data collection, focusing on longitudinal and large-scale data that looks at meanings and experiences specifically. Additionally, for anyone who's interested, these are 2 other related studies that are currently happening within NOAA's West Hawaiʻi Integrated Ecosystem Assessment. And finally, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to all of the interviewees who participated and created this research. Again, my name is Rebecca Ingram, and my email is here on the slide if anyone would like to reach me. Thank you so much for listening today.